Empty your backpack now, or I'm calling the police. 5 words. 5 words that would haunt Sarah Chen for the next decade. 5 words that would expose an ugly truth about Morton's drugstore and herself. But as the son of the city's most prominent pediatrician stood before her that day, hands trembling as he unzipped his backpack, no one could have predicted how one moment of prejudice would ignite a fire that would change everything. Sarah Chen stood behind the pharmacy counter at Morton's drugstore, methodically counting pills into amber bottles. After 15 years as head pharmacist in this suburban neighborhood, she prided herself on running a tight ship. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow across the white tile floor, reflecting off the neatly organized shelves of medication and sundries. The bell above the door chimed. Sarah glanced up to see a tall black teenager in a navy blue blazer enter the store. He moved with purpose, his backpack slung over one shoulder, school logo visible on his chest pocket. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. "Can I help you find anything?" she called out, watching as he made his way down the cold and flu aisle. "No thank you, ma'am. I know what I need," he replied politely, barely looking up as he studied the shelves. Sarah returned to her work, but kept one eye on the security mirror mounted in the corner. She'd seen too many shoplifting incidents over the years to let her guard down completely. The teen lingered in the same aisle for several minutes, occasionally picking up items and reading labels before putting them back. Finally, he selected a box of nighttime cold medicine and made his way toward the front. Instead of heading to the register, however, he turned down another aisle. Sarah's suspicion deepened. She watched as he slipped something into his backpack. "Excuse me," she called out sharply. "Young man, I need you to come to the counter right now." The teenager looked startled but complied, walking slowly to the pharmacy counter. "Please empty your backpack," Sarah demanded, already reaching for the store phone. "I saw you put something in there." "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I was just..." "Empty it now, or I'm calling the police," Sarah interrupted, her finger hovering over the keypad. The boy's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as other customers began to stare. Slowly, he unzipped his backpack and pulled out a white paper bag. "It's my prescription," he explained quietly. "I picked it up yesterday. I was just checking the instructions against the cold medicine to make sure they wouldn't interact." Sarah frowned, reaching for the bag. The label confirmed his story. It was indeed a prescription filled at Morton's the previous day. The name on the bottle read, Marcus Washington III. Her stomach dropped as recognition finally clicked. This wasn't just any teenager. This was Marcus Washington's son. Dr. Washington was one of the most respected pediatricians at the local children's hospital. Sarah had filled prescriptions for his patients countless times over the years. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her face burning with shame. "I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." "No, you shouldn't have," Marcus III agreed, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "But I'm used to it. That's why I always keep my receipts. Always wear my school uniform when I'm running errands. Always make sure my hands are visible. Because no matter what I do, some people will always see me as a threat first and a person second." He carefully placed the cold medicine on the counter. "I'd like to purchase this, please. Unless you think I'm planning to steal it too." Sarah's hands shook as she rang up the transaction. As she handed him his receipt, she noticed an elderly white woman watching them closely, her own prejudices clearly visible in her suspicious glare. Sarah had seen that look countless times before, but had never truly registered its impact until now. "Marcus, wait," she called as he turned to leave. "Would you have a moment to talk? I'd like to understand more about your experience, about what it's like to deal with people like me." He paused, studying her face for signs of sincerity. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "Okay, but not here." They moved to the small break room, where Sarah hung up her white coat and offered Marcus a chair. For the next hour, she mostly listened as he described growing up as the son of a successful black doctor, how that privilege both sheltered and failed to protect him from racism. He told her about being followed in stores, about security guards demanding to see his receipts while letting white customers pass unbothered, about police officers slowing down to watch him walk home from school. He described the careful calculations he made every day about what to wear, how to speak, where to put his hands. "The worst part isn't even the obvious stuff," he explained. "It's the constant second guessing. When someone is rude to me, is it because they're having a bad day or because of my skin color? When I don't get chosen for something, is it because someone else was better qualified or because they saw me as a threat? It's exhausting, always wondering." Sarah thought about her own son, just a year younger than Marcus. She tried to imagine him carrying that weight, that constant awareness. She couldn't. "I want you to know that what I did was wrong," she said finally. "Not just because I happened to be incorrect in this instance, but because I let my biases override my judgment. I looked at you and saw a stereotype instead of a person." Marcus nodded. Recognition is the first step, but what matters is what you do next. Will you help me? Sarah asked. Help me understand how to do better, how to be better. That's not really my job, Marcus pointed out. Black people shouldn't have to be responsible for educating white people about racism. But he paused, considering. My dad runs diversity and inclusion training sessions at the hospital sometimes. Maybe you could start there. Over the next few months, Sarah did more than just attend training sessions. She examined her own behaviors and assumptions. She spoke up when she witnessed other instances of racial profiling in the store. She developed new hiring practices to build a more diverse staff. Most importantly, she started really seeing her customers, all of them, as individuals with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dignity. One day, nearly a year later, Marcus came in again. This time, Sarah greeted him by name and asked about his college applications. They chatted easily as she filled his prescription, their earlier confrontation having evolved into something approaching friendship. As he turned to leave, he paused. You know, my dad told me something interesting the other day. Apparently, Morton's has the highest customer satisfaction ratings of any pharmacy in the network now. He said corporate is studying your location to figure out what changed. Sarah smiled. What changed is that we started treating everyone who walks through that door with the same respect, the same benefit of the doubt, the same humanity. It shouldn't have taken what happened with you for me to learn that lesson, but I'm grateful it did. So am I, Marcus replied, though I still keep my receipts. They shared a knowing look, acknowledgement that while individual growth was valuable, it was only one small step toward broader change, but it was a step worth taking. As Sarah watched Marcus leave, she noticed a young black girl entering the store. Looking nervous as she clutched a prescription paper, Sarah stepped out from behind the counter and gave her a warm smile. Welcome to Morton's, she said. How can I help you today? The girl's shoulders relaxed slightly as she approached the counter. Sarah thought about all the invisible burdens people carried, all the ways small interactions could either reinforce or begin to dismantle systems of prejudice. She thought about how easy it was to perpetuate harm without even realizing it, and how much work it took to learn to do better. But mostly, she thought about Marcus's words from that first difficult conversation. What matters is what you do next. And so she did what she had learned to do. She saw the person in front of her, not her assumptions about them. She listened more than she spoke. She worked to earn trust rather than demanding it. Day by day, interaction by interaction, she tried to be the change she wished she had been that day with Marcus. That young girl, as it turned out, was Keisha Robinson, a freshman at the same high school Marcus had attended. Like many of Sarah's interactions now, this one led to an ongoing relationship. Keisha would stop by regularly to pick up prescriptions for her grandmother, who suffered from diabetes and high blood pressure. One busy afternoon, Sarah overheard a heated exchange at the front counter. Her new technician, Amanda, was arguing with Keisha about a prescription. I've already told you, we can't fill this without proper ID, Amanda insisted, her voice carrying that edge of condescension that Sarah had learned to recognize as a warning sign. But Miss Chen knows me, Keisha protested. I've been picking up Grandma's medicines for months. She can't come down here herself. That's why she sent me. Sarah stepped forward, immediately noting how Amanda's hand had drifted toward the security button, the same button Sarah herself might have pressed a year ago. Is there a problem? She asked, careful to keep her tone neutral. Amanda turned to her with that conspiratorial look Sarah had seen too many times before. The assumption of shared suspicion. This girl claims she's picking up for her grandmother, but she doesn't have ID or proper authorization. This is Keisha Robinson, Sarah said firmly. She's authorized on her grandmother's account. I've personally verified her identity multiple times. The change in Amanda's demeanor was subtle but immediate. The slight straightening of her spine, the flicker of embarrassment across her face. Oh, I didn't realize. Annette, maybe that's something we should discuss during our next staff meeting, Sarah suggested quietly, about making fewer assumptions and asking better questions. After Keisha left with her grandmother's medication, Sarah called Amanda into her office. She recognized in the young technician's defensive posture the same resistance she had once felt herself, the instinctive pushback against having one's biases exposed. I know you were trying to follow protocol, Sarah began, but we need to talk about the difference between being careful and being prejudiced. I was just doing my job, Amanda protested. We're supposed to verify ID for prescription pickups. Yes, we are, Sarah agreed. But I noticed you didn't ask for ID from Mrs. Peterson when she picked up her husband's heart medication this morning, or from Mr. Thompson when he got his son's antibiotics. Amanda's silence spoke volumes. Let me tell you a story, Sarah said, and shared what had happened with Marcus. As she spoke, she could see Amanda's defenses slowly lowering, recognition dawning in her eyes. The thing is, Sarah continued, None of us thinks we're prejudiced. I certainly didn't. But prejudice isn't just about active hatred or deliberate discrimination. Sometimes it's about the small things, who we choose to question, who we give the benefit of the doubt, whose presence makes us reach for the security button. But how do we know when we're being appropriately cautious versus acting on bias? Amanda asked, and Sarah heard genuine confusion in her voice. That's exactly the right question to ask, Sarah responded. And the answer starts with being honest with ourselves. When we make these split-second decisions, we need to ask, would I react the same way if this person looked different? Would I be asking for this extra verification if they were white? Would I be suspicious if they were older? The conversation with Amanda sparked something new in Sarah. She realized that it wasn't enough to just change her own behavior. She had a responsibility to help others recognize and address their biases too. She began implementing regular training sessions for her staff, not just about pharmacy procedures, but about cultural competency and unconscious bias. She reached out to Dr. Washington, and together they developed a program to provide internship opportunities for students of color interested in healthcare careers. Marcus, now in his first year of pre-med studies, sometimes came back to mentor the high school interns. The changes weren't always smooth. Some longtime customers complained about the new political correctness. A few staff members resigned rather than participate in the training sessions. But gradually, the pharmacy's culture began to shift. One day, Dr. Washington himself came in to fill a prescription. As Sarah handed him his medication, he said something that made her pause. You know, I almost transferred Marcus to a different pharmacy after what happened that day. I wouldn't have blamed you, Sarah replied honestly. But I'm glad I didn't, he continued. Because sometimes, the most powerful change comes from people who have the courage to admit they were wrong and do the hard work of making it right. Sarah thought about that conversation often in the years that followed. She thought about how easy it would have been to simply apologize to Marcus and move on, to view the incident as a one-time mistake, rather than a symptom of deeper issues. She thought about how many other pharmacists, store clerks, and authority figures were still doing what she had done that day, making snap judgments based on race, reinforcing the very patterns that had shaped their own biases. The work was ongoing. Every new employee, every challenging interaction, every unconscious reaction was an opportunity to either perpetuate old patterns or create new ones. Sarah kept a photo on her desk now, a group shot from the pharmacy's internship program showing a diverse group of young people in white coats, their faces bright with possibility. Among them was Keisha, who had decided she wanted to become a pharmacist herself. The photo served as a daily reminder of both how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. It reminded her that change was possible, but it required more than just good intentions. It required consistent effort, uncomfortable conversations, and the willingness to look unflinchingly at one's own prejudices. As she looked at those young faces, Sarah thought about how a single interaction could have ripple effects far beyond what we can see. Her confrontation with Marcus could have been just another demoralizing example of racial profiling. Instead, it had become a catalyst for transformation, not just for her, but for an entire community. 5 years later, Morton's drugstore had become something of a case study in community transformation. What started as one pharmacist's journey of self-reflection had sparked a chain reaction throughout the neighborhood. Other businesses began to take notice and implement their own diversity initiatives, often consulting with Sarah about her experiences. One autumn morning, Sarah arrived at work to find an unexpected visitor waiting for her. It was Marcus. Now in his final year of medical school, he looked different, more confident, if possible, in his clinical rotation scrubs. Dr. Washington, she greeted him with a smile, using his future title. What brings you here today? Actually, he said, I'm here to talk about Keisha. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Keisha was now in her 3rd year of pharmacy school, still working part-time at Morton's during breaks. Is everything okay? More than okay. Marcus grinned. I'm helping coordinate a national conference on healthcare disparities, and we're looking for speakers who can discuss practical solutions. Keisha mentioned the mentorship program you've developed here. And well, we'd like you both to present. Sarah sat down heavily in her chair. I don't know, Marcus. Speaking at a conference, telling this story, feels uncomfortable, he finished for her. Good, it should. But discomfort is where growth happens. You taught me that, remember? Sarah did remember. She remembered every uncomfortable conversation, every challenging moment that had led to this point. She thought about how the story wasn't really hers to tell. It was Marcus's story, Keisha's story, the story of countless others who had faced similar situations with less positive outcomes. I'll do it, she said finally, but only if we tell the whole truth. The ugly parts, the difficult parts, the parts that make people squirm in their seats, no sugarcoating. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's exactly why we want you both there. This isn't about making white people feel better about addressing racism. It's about showing that real change is possible, but it requires honest acknowledgement of the problem and sustained effort to address it. As they discussed the conference details, a young black man entered the store. Sarah watched as Amanda, now her head technician, greeted him warmly and professionally. There was no hesitation, no suspicion, just one human being helping another. It was a small thing, but it represented years of intentional work to rebuild trust and reshape assumptions. The conference presentation became an unexpected turning point. Sarah and Keisha's honest account of their experiences, from that first confrontation to their current mentor-mentee relationship, resonated deeply with the audience. Healthcare professionals from across the country began reaching out, asking for guidance on implementing similar programs in their own communities. But more importantly, their story started conversations about the subtle ways bias manifests in healthcare settings. It wasn't just about dramatic confrontations. It was about the small daily interactions that could either reinforce or challenge systemic racism. It was about the importance of creating environments where everyone felt seen, respected, and valued. One evening, after a particularly long day of training new staff members, Sarah found herself reviewing old security footage. The cameras that had once been tools of surveillance had become instruments of education, helping staff recognize and address their own biases. She came across a clip from that fateful day with Marcus and felt a fresh wave of shame at her younger self's actions. But then she noticed something she hadn't before. In the background of the footage, a young Keisha was visible, watching the entire interaction. Years later, Keisha had confided that witnessing that moment, and more importantly, what happened afterward, had influenced her decision to pursue a career in healthcare. She wanted to be part of the change. You know what the real story is, Keisha had said during their conference presentation. It's not about a white pharmacist accusing a black teen of stealing. That happens every day. The real story is what happens next. When people have the courage to acknowledge their mistakes, do the hard work of changing, and bring others along on that journey. Sarah remembered how the audience had grown silent at those words. How many of them had their own stories of bias, their own moments of shame, their own opportunities for transformation. The ripple effects continued to spread. Morton's internship program expanded to other locations. The training materials Sarah and her team developed were adopted by healthcare facilities across the state. Dr. Washington, the elder Marcus, incorporated their case study into his hospital's residency program. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the subtle shift in the community itself. The pharmacy had become more than just a place to fill prescriptions. It was a model of what was possible when people committed to doing the hard work of confronting bias and building bridges. One day, Sarah overheard a conversation between two elderly customers, one white, one black, who had become friends through their regular visits to the pharmacy. They were discussing their grandchildren, sharing photos and stories with the easy familiarity of old friends. It was such a simple thing, yet it represented everything they had been working toward. The real miracle, Marcus had said during one of his visits, isn't that you changed. It's that you helped create an environment where change became contagious. As Sarah watched the two women chatting, she thought about how true that was. Change didn't happen in isolation. It happened in communities, in relationships, in the thousands of small interactions that either reinforced old patterns or created new ones. 10 years to the day after that initial confrontation, Sarah sat in the audience at the local medical school's graduation ceremony. She watched with pride as Marcus III walked across the stage to receive his medical degree, his father beaming from the faculty section. But it wasn't just Marcus's graduation that made this day special. In the pharmacy that morning, Sarah had received a letter that would change everything. The State Board of Pharmacy had approved her proposal for a comprehensive training program addressing racial bias in healthcare settings. What had started as one pharmacy's journey would now become mandatory training for all pharmacy staff across the state. After the ceremony, during the reception, Sarah found herself surrounded by familiar faces. There was Keisha, now a licensed pharmacist herself, running her own branch of Morton's in an underserved neighborhood. Amanda, who had gone on to become a pharmacy diversity coordinator for the entire Morton's chain. And of course, both Dr. Washington's, father and son, now preparing to work together at the Children's Hospital. I've been thinking, the younger Dr. Washington said, pulling Sarah aside. Remember that cold medicine I was trying to buy that day? Sarah nodded, the memory still sharp after all these years. I never actually bought it, he continued. I was too upset. But that moment of being presumed guilty, of having to defend my presence in a space where I had every right to be, it became the topic of my thesis, the health impact of racial profiling in medical settings. He handed her a bound copy of his research. I want you to have this. Your story is in here too, as an example of how institutions can change when leaders are willing to confront their biases head on. Sarah accepted the thesis with trembling hands. I never wanted to be an example, she admitted. None of us do, Marcus replied, but sometimes our worst moments become catalysts for our best work. Later that evening, as Sarah read through Marcus's thesis, she came across a section that brought tears to her eyes. It was an interview with a young black medical student who described how her interest in healthcare began when she witnessed a confrontation at a local pharmacy, and more importantly, what happened afterward. The student was quoted as saying, "What struck me wasn't the initial incident. We've all experienced something like that. What was different was watching this white pharmacist's journey from prejudice to advocacy. It showed me that change is possible, not just in individuals, but in systems. That's why I decided to become a doctor." The student's name was Keisha Robinson. Sarah closed the thesis and looked around her office. The walls were covered with photos now, graduating classes from the internship program, community health fair volunteers, staff training sessions. Each image told a story of transformation, not just of one person or one pharmacy, but of an entire community, learning to see and treat each other differently. On her desk sat a new frame, holding the latest addition to her collection, a photograph from Marcus's graduation. In it, 3 generations of change were captured. The elder Dr. Washington, who had fought battles Sarah could only imagine to become a respected pediatrician. Marcus III, who had turned an incident of prejudice into a catalyst for systemic change. And Keisha, representing the next generation of healthcare professionals, committed to building a more equitable future. As she prepared to leave for the day, Sarah noticed a teenage boy lingering nervously by the pharmacy counter. He was wearing a hoodie despite the warm weather, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. A decade ago, these might have been red flags to her. Now she saw what was really there. A young person in need of help, perhaps scared or uncertain about asking for it. "Welcome to Morton's," she said warmly, stepping out from behind the counter. "I'm Sarah. How can I help you today?" The boy looked up, surprised by her approach. I need to get birth control for my girlfriend," he stammered. "She's too embarrassed to come in herself," Sarah smiled, remembering all the times she had helped young people navigate these sensitive moments. "Let's talk about your options," she said, gesturing toward the consultation area. "And thank you for being there for your girlfriend when she needs support." As she helped the young man understand his girlfriend's prescription options and their safety protocols, Sarah reflected on how different this interaction was from similar ones a decade ago. The fear and suspicion that had once colored such encounters had been replaced by empathy and understanding. That evening, as she locked up the pharmacy, Sarah thought about how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. The work of dismantling prejudice was never really finished, but each interaction was an opportunity to choose differently, to see more clearly, to do better. She thought about all the young Marcus Washingtons and Keisha Robinsons who would walk through these doors in the years to come. They deserved more than just the absence of prejudice. They deserved to be seen, heard, and valued for exactly who they were. The real story, Sarah realized, wasn't just about what had happened that day with Marcus. It was about what happened every day since. The countless small choices that either reinforced old barriers or helped break them down. It was about the courage to face uncomfortable truths, the humility to learn from mistakes, and the persistence to keep working toward change even when it seemed impossible.